Elena Hart stood quietly by the window, watching the rain fall in steady sheets against the glass. She didn't sleep much these days. Since her husband Daniel died in a car crash 3 months ago, her nights were long and full of silence. She lived with her in-laws now, Margaret and Charles Hart, in their large old house where nothing ever felt warm, not even the walls. Her 2 children, Lily and Jonah, were the only reason she kept going. Jonah was 10, careful and thoughtful, always trying to be brave for his little sister. Lily was 6, sweet and curious, always asking when Daddy was coming back. Elena would hold her close and say nothing, just rub her back until she fell asleep. The Hart house was cold, not just from the weather, but from how it felt inside. Margaret kept everything spotless. The house ran like a tight schedule. Dinner at 6, lights out at 9, no music, no clutter. Charles hardly spoke unless he had something to correct. Elena tried to be respectful, but she always felt watched, judged. That night, past midnight, she couldn't sleep. Her hands were shaking again. She got out of bed and checked on Lily, who was curled up under the blanket. In the next room, Jonah was sleeping too. Carefully, she left the room and padded down the hallway, hoping a warm drink might help calm her nerves. As she neared the kitchen, she heard whispers. She stopped. It was Margaret's voice, low but sharp. "We need to move faster. She's breaking down more each day." Eleanor's heart jumped. "She's grieving, Margaret," Charles said. "That's exactly what we'll say in court, that she never recovered, that she's unstable. Those children need structure, not her moods and breakdowns." Eleanor backed up, pressing herself against the wall, just outside the kitchen door, her breath caught in her throat. "We'll say she had another episode," Margaret went on. "The neighbour saw her crying in the garden again. That'll help our case." "And the pills?" Charles asked. "I kept the bottle from the nightstand. We'll show how much she's been taking. I even told the doctor about it last week." Eleanor's legs felt weak. She clutched the wall for balance. They were setting her up. "We'll tell the court she's a danger to herself. Then we file for emergency custody," Margaret said calmly, as if discussing what to make for dinner. "Do you think we'll win?" Charles asked. "We will. We're the stable ones. She has no job, no property. She'll have no choice but to let them go." Eleanor turned and slipped back down the hall before they saw her. Her hands trembled and her mind raced. She got to her room and shut the door gently behind her. She looked at Lily's sleeping face. Her little girl stirred slightly, unaware of the storm building around her. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, heart thudding hard. They were going to take her children. They had already planned everything. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was war, and she wasn't going to lose. The next morning, Elena woke up early. She got the children ready for school, made breakfast, and even helped Margaret with the dishes. She smiled. She nodded. She laughed when she was supposed to. But inside, she was shaking. Every moment felt fake now. Every word from Margaret felt like a trap. Charles acted the same as always, quiet, cold, and watching. But now Eleanor knew why. They were planning something terrible, and they thought she didn't know. So she decided to act like she didn't. That afternoon, while Margaret and Charles were in the garden and the kids were at school, Eleanor took out the small voice recorder she had hidden in her old jewelry box. Daniel had bought it for her years ago to help her remember her songwriting ideas. Now, it would have a different purpose. She tucked it under the couch cushions in the living room, where most of the family conversations happened. She tested it once, pressed record, said a few words, and played them back. The sound was clear enough. She pressed record again and left it running. By dinner, Eleanor had returned to her quiet, calm self. She helped serve the food. She smiled at Charles and told Margaret the stew was delicious. They were surprised at how cheerful she was, but neither said anything. The family sat down to pray before eating. Margaret's voice was slow and soft. "Dear Lord, give us wisdom and strength in difficult time. Help us do what is best for the children." Eleanor opened her eyes. Margaret's hands were folded, but her lips were curled in the slightest smile. Eleanor swallowed hard and closed her eyes again. After dinner, Lily sat on her lap as they read a story together. Then, out of nowhere, Lily said, "Grandma said you might go to a hospital. Is that true?" Eleanor froze for a second. She looked at her daughter's round, innocent face. Lily looked confused, not scared. "What did she say, sweetheart?" Elena asked gently. "She said sometimes mommies get sad and need special rest. But she said not to worry, that she and Grandpa would take care of us if you go." Elena hugged Lily tight, too tight. "I'm not going anywhere, baby," she whispered. That night, once the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Elena returned to the living room and carefully took out the recorder. Her hands were shaking. She sat on her bed, pressed play, and listened. At first it was just chairs moving, dishes clinking, then Margaret's voice. "No, say it like this." She was holding the knife and talking to herself. That sounds more believable. There was a pause. Then she heard Charles speak. "She gets nervous in crowds. Use that too. Say she panicked at the market." Margaret laughed. "Yes, perfect. Add the part about the pills. Say you found her counting them again. That'll scare the judge." Elena covered her mouth. They were rehearsing what to say in court, making up lies, trying to sound convincing. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not this time. She listened to the whole recording until it ended. Then she stared into the dark room, her mind racing. They weren't just trying to take her children. They were trying to destroy her, but now she had proof, and she wasn't going to let them win. The attic was cold and full of dust. Eleanor hadn't been up there in months. Cobwebs hung from the low ceiling, and the wooden boards creaked under her steps. A single small window let in pale light, and the air smelled like old paper and forgotten memories. She had come up here looking for something, anything, that might help her understand Daniel's state of mind before he died. There were still a few boxes of his things left untouched. Sweaters folded neatly, a dusty guitar, his college notebooks, a broken watch. All pieces of the man she had loved so deeply. Each item made her chest ache. Then she saw the old wooden chest. It had a rusty lock on it, one she didn't recognize. She remembered Daniel once mentioning he had a place to hide private things, where his parents wouldn't snoop. Her hands trembled as she pulled the chest closer. It was heavier than it looked. She looked around and found a small hammer in a nearby toolbox. With one strong strike, the lock snapped open. Inside the chest were some photo albums, a leather journal, and, at the bottom, a phone. It was Daniel's old phone, not the one he had been using before the crash, but one from before that. She had thought it was lost or thrown out. She held it tightly. The screen was black. The battery was dead. Back downstairs, she plugged it in. It took a long time to turn on. She sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen, afraid of what she might find. When the phone finally buzzed to life, her heart skipped. No messages, no calls, just one voice memo. It was labelled with a date 2 weeks before Daniel's accident. She pressed play. At first, there was only silence. Then Daniel's voice came through, shaky and slurred. "If you're hearing this, I don't know if I'll be around much longer. I don't know what's real anymore. I think someone's been drugging me. I can't trust anything, not even my own parents." He took a deep breath, then coughed. "They say I'm paranoid, but I know what I feel. I feel sick, confused, like my head isn't mine. I caught Mum putting something in my tea once. She smiled when I asked about it, said it was just herbs for stress. But I don't believe her. I don't believe either of them. If anything happens to me, please, please look after the kids. And Elena, tell her I love her, always." The message ended. Elena sat frozen, the phone still in her hand. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She played it again, just to be sure she hadn't imagined it. Daniel's voice sounded so lost, so afraid. He had known. He had tried to speak, and nobody had listened. Now she couldn't stop shaking. Was it possible that his crash hadn't been an accident, that his parents had done something to him, to silence him? They were already trying to erase her, to take the children. What else were they capable of? Her sadness turned sharp. No longer just grief, but fury. Her heart pounded in her chest. The weight of all the quiet lies and fake smiles hit her at once. She thought of Margaret's sweet voice during prayers, of Charles pretending to care, of Lily saying, "Grandma said you might go to a hospital." All of it. Every moment was a trick. They had taken Daniel from her. Now they wanted the children too. Number this wasn't just about defending herself anymore. This was about justice, about truth, about revenge. She stood up and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale, tired, but her eyes were steady now. They wanted a quiet, scared woman. Instead, they had made a storm. It was just after breakfast when the knock came. Elena opened the front door to find a man in a grey suit, holding a thick envelope. He looked at her with cold politeness. "Elena Hart?" he asked. "Yes," she replied slowly. "I'm here on behalf of the court. You've been served." He handed her the envelope and walked away before she could say another word. Her hands trembled as she closed the door. The children were upstairs playing. She took the envelope into the dining room and opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page, and then everything went quiet in her head. Emergency custody, filed by Charles and Margaret Hart. They claimed she was unstable, that she had been neglecting the children, that she was having hallucinations. They said she was unfit to be a mother. The room began to spin. Her breathing became shallow. She read on. The papers were filled with lies. Margaret had written that Eleanor talked to herself, that she stayed locked in her room for hours, that the children had once gone unfed. She even said Eleanor cried loudly at night, disturbing the children's sleep. None of it was true. She looked up just as Margaret entered the room. The older woman's face was calm, almost kind. "This isn't personal, Elena," she said gently. "It's for the children." Elena couldn't even answer. Her throat was tight, her vision blurred. She stumbled into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor. The sobs came fast, raw, deep sobs from a place she hadn't touched in weeks. She cried into her hands, rocking slightly. This was too much. First Daniel, now this. They wanted to erase her, to take the only reason she had left to live. For a long time, she just wept. But slowly, something inside her shifted. She looked up at her own reflection in the mirror above the sink. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet. She looked broken. But then, quietly, almost automatically, she stood up, took a deep breath, and washed her face. She dried her hands and picked up the papers again. She read them a second time, this time, not as a victim, but as someone studying an enemy. The words were sharp, cruel, and false. But she saw something else now. Patterns, holes, weak spots, and the signature at the bottom of the last page confirmed it. Charles had used an old friend of his from the city to file the claim. A judge he knew personally was assigned the hearing. It was all too neat, too planned. She opened her closet and pulled down the small box Daniel had once given her. Inside was a bank card, a private account. He had told her to keep it safe for emergencies. She sat on her bed and opened her laptop. Within an hour, she had hired a private investigator. Her email to him was short and clear. "I want everything on Charles and Margaret Hart. Financials, health records, past legal activity, anything unusual. I'll double your rate if you work fast." She hit send, then she went downstairs. Margaret was humming in the kitchen, pretending nothing had happened. Charles was in his study, typing away on his computer. They thought she would break, that she would panic and beg, but they had made a mistake. They thought they were dealing with the same quiet woman who had lost her husband. They didn't know what she had found in the attic. They didn't know Daniel had left her a warning. They didn't know she was done being afraid. That night she stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the rain falling on the garden. She whispered to herself, her voice steady and low. "Now it's my turn." It started with Charles's phone call. Eleanor had overheard him say, "I'll drive down to the property this afternoon." He didn't know she was listening from the staircase. He thought she was out shopping with Lily and Sam. But Eleanor stayed hidden and waited. Hours later, she watched him from the upstairs window as he got into his silver car and drove off alone. She quickly grabbed her keys, slipped out the back door, and followed him in her car, keeping a safe distance behind. Charles drove for almost an hour through narrow back roads lined with trees and overgrown bushes. Eventually, he turned onto a dirt path and stopped beside a small, weathered shed near the woods. It looked abandoned, no windows, just a rusted door and a sagging roof. He got out, unlocked the door, and went inside. Eleanor waited. 20 minutes later, he came back out empty-handed, locked the door again, and drove off. She waited until his car had disappeared completely. Then she stepped out of her car, walked up to the shed, and touched the cold padlock. It looked old, but not too secure. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin metal pin, a tool she had kept since college, from a forgotten lock-picking class she took on a dare. After a few tries, the lock clicked open. She stepped inside. The air was thick and stale. Dust floated in the faint sunlight coming from a hole in the roof. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, jars, and what looked like very old furniture. In the corner was a small desk. On it sat an old lamp, a few folders, and a plastic bag filled with prescription bottles. Eleanor picked them up and looked closely. The labels had different names, different dates. Some were 10 years old. All were heavy sedatives. She opened one of the folders and froze. Inside were drawings, old, faded drawings made with crayon. A small boy standing behind bars. A stick figure of a man, larger, with angry red eyes. A sad child in the corner of a dark room. In the corner of each page was a small signature, Daniel. Eleanor felt her knees grow weak. She sat on the floor and flipped through the drawings, page after page of sadness and fear, drawn by her husband when he was just a boy. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found newspaper clippings. She read the headline on one: "Teen found dead after overdose, ruled accidental." The article mentioned a family gathering, a cousin named Peter. Another paper had a photo, Daniel, barely a teen, standing beside Peter and Charles, all smiling. Another clipping was folded tightly, like someone had read it over and over. Elena opened it. The last line read, "No charges were filed." The family declined to comment. She placed the papers, bottles, and drawings into her bag. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. This wasn't just about taking her children. This family had secrets, deep ones. She stepped outside and locked the shed again. As she got back into her car, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the private investigator, a voice memo. She pressed play. His voice was low and serious. "Elena, I found something. You won't like what I found next." The courtroom was cold and quiet. Eleanor sat at the front, her palms sweating as her name was called. Margaret and Charles were already seated, dressed in dark, formal clothes. Margaret wore her usual soft smile, the kind that looked polite but never reached her eyes. Charles sat stiffly beside her, his lawyer flipping through a folder of papers. The judge looked at Elena. "We're here to review the emergency custody petition filed by Mr. and Mrs. Hart against their daughter-in-law, Elena Hart." The in-law's lawyer stood up first. His voice was calm, steady. "Your Honor, the Harts are concerned about their grandchildren. Mrs. Elena Hart has shown erratic behavior since her husband's passing. She's isolated, unpredictable, and we have reason to believe she may pose a risk to the children's safety." He handed over a stack of papers. "Witnesses will confirm episodes of confusion, shouting at no one, and signs of neglect. Our clients only wish to ensure the children are safe and cared for." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Her own lawyer leaned toward her and whispered, "Breathe. Wait for your moment." Margaret stood and gently wiped her eyes with a tissue. "We love those children. We raised our son with love, and we've only ever wanted what's best for his family. But since Daniel's death, Eleanor hasn't been herself. She locks herself away. The children seem afraid. This is not revenge. This is love." The judge nodded and turned to Eleanor. "Do you have anything to say in response, Mrs. Hart?" Eleanor stood slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She reached into her bag and placed a small recorder on the table. "This is a voice memo my husband, Daniel Hart, recorded shortly before his death. It was hidden in his phone, which I found in the attic weeks ago. He was scared, and I believe he had reason to be." She pressed play. Daniel's tired voice filled the courtroom. "If something happens to me, please know I didn't trust them anymore. They're drugging me. I don't feel safe. I think they're trying to break me down." The room fell silent. Even Charles blinked in surprise. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing. Elena continued. "I also hired a private investigator after my in-laws filed their motion. He found hidden medical records, prescription drugs, and even childhood drawings by Daniel that suggest long-term emotional abuse." She handed over printed reports from the PI, as well as photos taken inside the shed. "Additionally, I'd like to call a witness, Dr. Melinda Crane. She was Daniel's childhood therapist. A woman with kind eyes and a calm voice stepped up. She introduced herself and took the stand. "Daniel was referred to me when he was 10, she began. "He showed signs of deep anxiety, nightmares, and fear of his home environment. He spoke of being locked in his room for hours, of being told no one would believe him if he spoke out. I reported it to Child Services once, but the case was closed. I always believed Daniel was telling the truth." The judge's expression shifted. He looked toward Margaret and Charles. Charles looked pale. Margaret no longer smiled. Elena sat down. Silence filled the room for a moment longer. Then the judge leaned forward. "I will be requesting a full investigation into Mr. and Mrs. Hart's past conduct. For now, emergency custody is denied. The children will remain with their mother." A loud breath escaped Elena's lips. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. Charles stood suddenly. "This is ridiculous. That's ancient history. He was just a boy." Margaret reached out to stop him, but it was too late. The judge's voice rose. "Enough, Mr. Hart. You are now under review. If there's even a hint of misconduct, the court will act accordingly." Eleanor watched as Charles sat back down, his hands clenched. Margaret looked at the floor. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like the frightened woman hiding in corners. She had taken back control, and this was only the beginning. Elena returns to the shed. She burns the entire place, symbolically destroying the history and power they tried to bury. The night air was cold, and the forest around her was still. But inside Elena, a storm was raging. She stood in front of the shed, holding a small red gasoline can and a lighter in her coat pocket. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with purpose. She stepped inside. The smell of old wood, dust, and forgotten memories filled her nose. Everything looked the same. The broken shelves, the scattered papers, the bottles of drugs still sitting on the table like quiet witnesses. The drawings Daniel had made as a child were still there, faded, sad pictures of a boy behind bars, a boy with wide, scared eyes. She took a long breath, then began to pour the gasoline, slowly, carefully, across the floor, over the table, around the lockbox. The liquid soaked into the wood. She moved like someone laying a body to rest. Eleanor paused in the middle of the room. She looked down at one drawing on the ground. Daniel had drawn a boy screaming and a woman standing beside him, her face blank. Margaret. The fire inside Elena grew hotter than the one she was about to start. She pulled out the lighter, flicked it, and held the flame out. A moment later, the fire leapt to life. It started small, dancing along the floorboards, but soon it grew hungry, swallowing everything, the memories, the pain, the secrets this family had hidden for years. The flames reached for the ceiling, curling the edges of paper, breaking glass, turning every lie into smoke. Eleanor stepped out and stood a few feet away. She watched in silence as the shed was consumed. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. Far off in the distance, sirens wailed, but they weren't for her. At the Hart estate, police cars pulled into the driveway. Officers stepped out and knocked firmly on the front door. Charles opened it, frowning. "Yes? Charles Hart?" one officer asked, showing a badge. "You're under arrest for tax fraud, business misrepresentation, and tampering with financial documents." Charles's mouth dropped open. "What? There must be some mistake." The officers didn't wait. They turned him around and cuffed him. Margaret came rushing out from the kitchen. "What are you doing to my son?" she shouted. "Get your hands off him!" The officer looked at her calmly. "Ma'am, step aside. I'll call our lawyer. You might want to call one for yourself too," the other officer said. "You're being named in an ongoing investigation." Margaret's hands trembled. Her eyes darted to the hallway, where Eleanor stood, calmly watching. They locked eyes. Margaret's fury turned to fear. Later that evening, inside the Hart living room, Eleanor set her phone on the coffee table and hit record. Detective Reyes sat across from Margaret, her notebook open, her voice calm. "We need to ask you a few questions, Margaret," she said. "I've already told you. This is all a misunderstanding. Your son Daniel, he had reason to believe someone was drugging him, that he was in danger." Margaret's jaw tightened. Daniel was confused. He had episodes. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Reyes continued. "Did you ever give Daniel anything without his knowledge?" "No." Reyes glanced down at her notes, then said, "What about the shed? What was stored there?" Margaret looked away. "Old things. Drugs? Papers? Daniel's childhood drawings?" Silence. Reyes's eyes narrowed. "Margaret, this is your chance to tell the truth." Something cracked. Margaret stood up, suddenly shaking. Her voice cracked. "I did it for him," she said. "He was always weak, always emotional. He didn't know how to be a man. Charles said we had to make him stronger." "So you drugged him?" Reyes asked. Margaret didn't answer. She was crying now. Reyes nodded and closed her notebook. "Thank you. That's all we need." She stood and looked at Elena. "We'll take it from here." Elena nodded quietly. As the officers led Margaret away, Elena sat back on the couch, her hands in her lap. The fire had burned down the past, and now justice had done the rest. It was over. It was quiet now. Eleanor lived in a small house with her 2 children. No more whispers, no more fear, just peace. One evening, while they were drawing, Lily looked up and said, "Daddy told me Grandma had a brother who lived in the walls." Eleanor froze. "What do you mean?" "He was locked inside. He cried a lot. Daddy said Grandma didn't like him." That night, Elena opened Daniel's old journal. A page had always been missing. 2 days later, an envelope came. No name, no message. Inside was a child's drawing of a boy behind bricks. His mouth was red and sealed. Elena stared at it. Then she got up, walked to the window, and closed the blinds.